Have you ever gone home after spending the whole day out shooting, really excited to look at the images that you just took, just to find out that they are not nearly as good as you were expecting them to be? They probably lack contrast. Contrast is one of the most important elements in photography, and here I'm not talking about, or not only about the slider that you can change in Lightroom and you can increase or decrease the contrast. Let's see what contrast is, why it is important, and how we can add more of it into our images. Contrast means difference. To me, is what separates the subject, what we are trying to capture, from everything else. It's the main tool that we have to tell stories with our images. One of the most common mistakes in photography is to expect what we see with our eyes to feel the same in an image. The thing is that a camera doesn't see things the same way that we do with our eyes, not only because physically there are some differences, but also because we have the brain and senses. The brain interprets what it's getting from the eyes, and the senses add a context to what we are seeing. It might be hard to notice, but when you are looking at something, that little something is the only thing in focus in your vision, and everything else is out of focus. It's still there because you need to be aware of your surroundings, just in case something happens, but your brain and your eyes are completely focused on that thing that you're looking at. And this is why depth of field is really important in photography, because it kind of does the same, and it helps us isolating things from others that are farther away or closer to us. So what happens is that if we are walking through the woods, for example, and we see something that we like a tree in the distance, and we like the way that tree looks, chances are that we're not going to be able to make a good image of that tree unless it is separated by some distance from the other trees and it has a clean background, so we can use a fast lens to actually isolate that tree. Otherwise, there is going to be too much noise. It's not going to be enough contrast between the subject and everything else. So the idea behind the contrast is to help the viewer and to give them an anchor, a place to look at first when they first look at the image, and from there they can expand to the rest of the image if they want to, or if the image calls for that, but at least to have something to look at. When there is not enough contrast in the image, it is very hard to make the viewer pay attention to just that one thing that you were trying to show. We need to understand that sometimes we just can't create enough contrast to make a good image, and we just need to move on. What I'm looking for in my images is usually to have a high contrast between the subject and the background or foreground, whatever it is that is not the actual subject that I'm trying to capture. And that could be achieved by different ways. For example, with shapes, textures, and of course, the difference in color or black and white or luminance. So now we are going to look at some sample images that I have here to try to clarify these concepts that I'm talking about. So these first two images are just to show you, as I said, we need a contrast between the subject and everything else. We don't want contrast, or we want as little contrast as possible happening in the background or the foreground and within the subject itself. So here, this was Lago di Garda, and we have this platform, and one of the images is just a snapshot. I froze the movement of the water so you can see the waves. That means even though there is a contrast between the platform and everything else, the image is not bad per se. There is contrast in the water. There is contrast between this wave and the part where the water is more still and calm, and there is contrast against the mountains in the background as well. So one of the ways to decrease the contrast in the background itself is to use long exposures. I love using long exposures, and what that did, as you can see in this image, is to remove all the details in the water, so that increases the contrast between the water and the actual subject that we are trying to photograph. But we don't need long exposures all the time. For example, in these images that I'm showing you now, for example, here I'm using like the shape of a dog here, but it's the same concept. The water was very, very calm at this lake, Lago di Varese, and it was foggy as well. So you know where I'm going. You need to use the weather in your advantage as well, with foggy weather, with snow, stuff that declutters the background and adds contrast between the subject and everything else. This other example of the ducks at sunrise, once again, the background disappears because of the fog, and that adds contrast between that background and the actual subject, that is the ducks, because it removes contrast. It decreases the contrast in the background. Otherwise, we will have some mountains and some trees in the background, some houses that right now you cannot see. So that adds the contrast or increases the contrast between the subject and the background. So yeah, I'm just showing you more examples now, but I hope it's clear what I'm trying to say here. Another way, another trick that I use to add contrast between the subject and everything else is I crush the blacks. I think that's pretty obvious. I remove as much detail as possible in the shadows. You can see here in this path in the Thies Islands. I was to make the path stand out from everything else. If I were to show every single leaf and trunks and trees and bushes around the path would stand out less, and it would make, in my opinion, for a slightly worse image because the eye doesn't directly go there to the path. Another of my favorites is to use silhouettes, as you can see here in this photo of New York, or the photos that I made in Washington, D.C. And yeah, it's always contrasting a bright background against a dark subject, and just kind of hint what that subject is without showing all the details in the subject. The contrast between that subject and the background is huge here, and it doesn't work for everything, only for some elements like buildings, because you can still see what they are, you can have an idea. Sometimes it might be just too much for other situations. Another idea I suggested was to use shapes. One thing that I like to do is to place poles, trees, and stuff like that, vertical stuff, against farther away backgrounds. And as you can see here, I think I made this image in New Mexico, or the ones that I made at the Golden Gate bridge, like that telephone pole against the bridge and stuff like that. Then textures are very important as well. As you can see here, I have the grass in the foreground and showing the deer in the background. And of course, then we have the classic contrast that we are looking for when photographing black and white, that is white versus black, like this example of the horse that I took in northern Spain, another image that I made here of these 3 trees in the snow. So all of those work because it's white versus black, and that works very well always. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, and sometimes I'm looking for contrast, but very, very subtle. The best example is the image that I made at the White Dunes in New Mexico. As you can see, there is a contrast between the dunes and the moon, that are the main subject. What I'm trying to capture there, they are brighter than the sky, that is slightly darker, but the contrast here is much more subtle, and this works very well. When it works very well, even more than having higher contrast between the elements in the photo. But you have to be careful. You need to make sure that the viewer is going to understand what they are looking at, or at least have an idea, because they might just lose interest if they don't have an anchor to look at. One thing that we can do to check if the image has enough contrast is to blur out the image and to apply a filter on top of it. For example, this image does not have any filter applied to it. This was almost straight out of camera that way, but as you can see, you are still able to recognize what the subject is. Even if the subject is a little bit abstract, you don't know what it is or what is going on here, you still see clearly from the very beginning, this is the subject, and everything else is the background or the foreground. It's just the context for that subject. So if we blur out our images and we are still able to see that, that's a good sign. And yeah, these were just a few examples of how I create and increase contrast in my images. Of course, I also use the slider in Lightroom. My images are very high contrasty in that sense as well, but that's to crush the blacks and to make those whites a little bit brighter, to remove details on both sides of the histogram, so the subject can stand out even more. And that's all I had about this. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.